In the summer of 1944, a column of German armor stretched across 20 kilometers of French countryside. Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks moved in coordinated formation, representing one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable fighting forces. Within hours, this elite Panzer unit would be reduced to burning wreckage scattered across the hedgerows of Normandy. The attackers never fired a single tank round. They never engaged in ground combat. What happened in those brief, devastating moments would fundamentally change how modern militaries understood the concept of mobile warfare. The Allied invasion of Normandy had begun 6 weeks earlier. On June 6, 1944, thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches of northern France, establishing a foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of Europe. But the battle for France was far from over. German forces had not collapsed. Instead, they had reorganized, bringing forward their most elite armored divisions to contain the Allied breakout and potentially drive them back into the sea. Among these divisions was an elite Panzer formation, equipped with the most advanced tanks Germany could field. These were not the outdated models that had struggled in the opening weeks of the invasion. These were Tiger tanks with 88mm guns capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. These were Panther tanks, whose sloped armor and powerful cannons had earned fearsome reputations on the Eastern Front. Supporting them were mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and supply columns carrying the fuel and ammunition needed to sustain operations deep into Allied territory. The unit had been ordered forward to reinforce German positions south of Caen, where British and Canadian forces were pressing against increasingly desperate defenses. The Panzer commanders understood the urgency. If the Allies broke through here, they could sweep across the relatively flat terrain toward Paris, potentially ending the war months earlier than Hitler's strategists hoped. Every available armor reserve was being committed to hold the line, to buy time for additional fortifications, to make the Allies pay for every kilometer in blood and steel. On the morning of the strike, the weather was clear. The column moved with practiced efficiency along narrow rural roads, maintaining intervals between vehicles to reduce vulnerability to artillery. Reconnaissance elements ranged ahead, watching for signs of Allied ground forces. Radio operators maintained communication between battalion commanders and regimental headquarters. Everything proceeded according to German military doctrine, refined through years of mechanized warfare across multiple theaters. The Panzer crews were veterans. Many had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. They knew their machines intimately, understanding the mechanical temperament of each tank, the optimal range for their weapons, the techniques for hold-down positions that maximized armor protection. They trusted their training, their officers, and their equipment. They had reason for confidence. German armor doctrine remained among the most sophisticated in the world, emphasizing combined arms coordination, tactical flexibility, and aggressive counterattacks. But doctrine developed for ground warfare was about to encounter a threat that operated in 3 dimensions. High above the column, beyond the range of human vision, Allied reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the movement. Coordinates were transmitted to airfields across southern England. Pilots were briefed. Aircraft were armed. The machinery of aerial interdiction was set in motion with industrial efficiency. The Panzer unit continued its advance, unaware that it had been marked for destruction. They could not know that their carefully planned movement along interior lines had been observed, analyzed, and prioritized as a target of strategic importance. They could not know that the clear skies that aided their navigation also provided perfect conditions for the hunters now preparing to strike. In the calculus of modern warfare, they had become numbers on a target list, coordinates on a map, a concentration of enemy armor requiring immediate neutralization. What was about to occur represented the culmination of years of tactical innovation, technological development, and hard-won experience. The Allies had learned painful lessons about the vulnerability of armor to air attack. They had refined techniques for aircraft ground coordination. They had developed weapons specifically designed to penetrate tank armor from above, where it was thinnest. They had created a system capable of delivering devastating firepower with precision and speed that ground forces could not match. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be studied in military academies for generations. Not a battle in the traditional sense, but a demonstration of how air power could decisively influence ground operations. The Panzer column represented the old certainties of armored warfare. The approaching aircraft represented a new reality that would define military thinking for decades to come. The destruction of massed armor from the air did not emerge fully formed on that summer day in 1944. It was the result of evolutionary development that had accelerated dramatically during the war years. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the concept of close air support existed primarily in theory. Aircraft could strafe ground targets and drop bombs, but coordination between air and ground forces remained primitive. Radio communication was unreliable. Target identification from altitude was difficult. Bombs often missed their intended targets by hundreds of meters. The German Blitzkrieg had relied heavily on the Stuka dive bomber, a purpose-built aircraft designed to provide flying artillery for advancing ground forces. The Stuka's shrieking dive and pinpoint accuracy had terrorized defenders across Poland and France. But as the war progressed, the Stuka's vulnerabilities became apparent. It was slow, poorly armed for air combat, and helpless against modern fighters. By 1944, the Stuka had been largely withdrawn from Western theaters, a victim of Allied air superiority. The British and Americans had taken different approaches to the problem of air-ground coordination. The Royal Air Force developed the cab rank system, maintaining flights of fighter bombers in designated patrol zones, ready to respond to calls from ground controllers. Forward air controllers, positioned with frontline units, could identify targets and direct strikes with increasing precision. The system had been refined in North Africa, where open terrain and concentrated enemy formations provided ideal conditions for experimentation. American forces emphasized the fighter bomber, converting proven air superiority fighters into ground attack platforms. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor, proved remarkably effective in the ground attack role. Its rugged construction could withstand significant battle damage. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns could shred light vehicles and suppress anti-aircraft positions. Most importantly, it could carry substantial bomb loads or rockets, weapons specifically designed to destroy armored vehicles. The rocket was the critical innovation. Earlier bombs, even heavy ones, often failed to destroy tanks unless scoring direct hits. The armored roof of a Tiger tank was relatively thin, but bombs falling at angles often glanced off or detonated harmlessly nearby. Rockets, however, could be fired in relatively flat trajectories, increasing hit probability. High-velocity armor-piercing rockets could penetrate tank armor. High-explosive rockets could disable vehicles through blast effect and fragmentation. By mid-1944, Allied tactical air forces had accumulated thousands of sorties worth of experience. Pilots understood how to identify targets from altitude, how to coordinate attacks, how to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. They had learned to strike in waves, with initial aircraft suppressing defenses while following flights delivered killing blows. They had developed standardized attack profiles, approach angles, and escape maneuvers that balanced effectiveness against survivability. The German response to this threat had been inadequate. Early in the war, German forces had enjoyed air superiority and had not prioritized mobile anti-aircraft protection for ground units. Flak units existed, but they were often positioned to protect fixed installations rather than accompanying mobile formations. The famous 88mm gun, devastating in the anti-tank role, was too heavy and slow to provide effective mobile air defense. Lighter 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons existed, but in insufficient numbers. German armor tactics had been developed assuming friendly air superiority, or at least parity. Doctrine emphasized movement, concentration, and shock action. Panzer units were trained to advance rapidly, to seek decisive engagement, to exploit breakthrough with deep penetration. These tactics assumed freedom of movement. They assumed that columns could move during daylight hours without facing annihilation from above. That assumption had become increasingly untenable. The Panzer unit moving through Normandy that morning represented Germany's attempt to maintain offensive capability despite Allied air dominance. They moved during daylight because the tactical situation demanded speed. The front was collapsing. Reinforcements were needed immediately. Night movement would be safer, but too slow. The gamble was calculated based on the hope that Allied air forces might be occupied elsewhere, or that the column could reach its destination before being detected and engaged. The unit's composition reflected both Germany's strengths and its growing weaknesses. The Tigers and Panthers were formidable weapons, superior in armor and firepower to anything the Allies fielded. But they were mechanically complex, fuel-hungry, and available in limited numbers. Supporting vehicles included older Panzer IV tanks, capable but increasingly outmatched. Half-tracks carried Panzer Grenadiers, the mechanized infantry essential for combined arms operations. Supply trucks carried fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, the logistical lifeline without which the entire formation would grind to a halt. The column stretched across 20 kilometers not by choice but by necessity. Concentrating vehicles increased vulnerability to aerial attack. Dispersing them complicated command and control, but reduced the chance that a single strike could destroy the entire formation. The spacing represented a compromise, an attempt to balance competing tactical requirements in an environment where the enemy dominated the skies. Intelligence reports had warned of Allied air activity, but intelligence could not predict when or where strikes would occur. The Luftwaffe was absent, withdrawn to protect German cities from strategic bombing or held in reserve for operations that never materialized. The Panzer crews were alone, dependent on their own vigilance, and the limited protection offered by vehicle-mounted machine guns against aircraft traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The reconnaissance aircraft that spotted the column was a Supermarine Spitfire, fitted with cameras instead of guns, operating at altitude where German ground fire could not reach. The pilot observed the column, noted its composition and direction, and transmitted coordinates via radio. Within minutes, the information reached the headquarters of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, the RAF command responsible for air operations over the invasion front. The target was assessed and prioritized. A 20-kilometer column of German armor represented exactly the kind of target Allied air forces had been trained to destroy. Orders were transmitted to multiple squadrons. Fighter bombers were armed with rockets and bombs. Pilots received briefings showing maps, coordinates, and expected defenses. The attack would be conducted in waves, with flights arriving at intervals to maintain continuous pressure and prevent German recovery or dispersal. The first wave consisted of 8 Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers, aircraft specifically optimized for ground attack. Each Typhoon carried 8 RP-3 rockets under its wings, 60-pound warheads propelled by solid fuel motors. The rockets were not precision weapons. Pilots fired them in salvos, saturating target areas rather than aiming for individual vehicles. But against a column stretching across kilometers of road, precision was unnecessary. The Typhoons approached at low altitude, following terrain features to avoid early detection. As they neared the target area, they climbed to attack altitude, approximately 2,000 feet, balancing visibility against exposure to ground fire. The flight leader identified the head of the column and designated initial targets. The attack would begin at the front, blocking escape routes, then work backward along the column. German troops saw the aircraft approaching. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons toward the threat. Machine gunners on half-tracks and tanks opened fire, sending streams of tracers skyward. The volume of fire was substantial, but largely ineffective. Aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour presented difficult targets. Most fire passed harmlessly behind or below the attacking planes. The lead Typhoon rolled into its attack dive. The pilot aligned his aircraft with the road, centered the targeting reticle on a Tiger tank leading the column, and fired his rockets in a rippling salvo. 8 white smoke trails arced downward. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate, but at least 2 struck the target area. One hit the Tiger directly, penetrating the turret roof. The explosion was catastrophic. Ammunition inside the tank detonated, blowing the turret completely off the chassis. The Tiger erupted in flames, blocking the narrow road. Following Typhoons struck in rapid succession. Rockets slammed into vehicles along the column. Panthers, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and supply trucks exploded or caught fire. Crews abandoned damaged vehicles, seeking cover in ditches and hedgerows. Some vehicles attempted to disperse into adjacent fields, but the terrain was unsuitable for armor. Tanks became bogged in soft ground or entangled in vegetation. The second wave arrived before German forces could recover. These aircraft carried bombs rather than rockets, 500-pound general-purpose weapons designed to destroy through blast effect. They targeted the densest concentrations of vehicles, areas where the column had bunched together around bottlenecks or road junctions. The bombs were devastating. Even near misses could flip tanks, collapse suspension systems, or ignite fuel and ammunition. Chaos spread through the column. Radio discipline collapsed as unit commanders attempted to coordinate responses. Some ordered dispersal. Others demanded concentration for mutual air defense support. The contradictory orders created confusion. Vehicles collided attempting to maneuver off-road. Crews abandoned tanks that were still operational, believing their vehicles were doomed. The hedgerow terrain of Normandy, which had provided excellent defensive positions against Allied infantry, now trapped the German armor. The high earthen banks topped with dense vegetation created natural barriers. Roads were the only practical routes for heavy vehicles. Leaving the roads meant becoming bogged down or stuck. Staying on the roads meant remaining exposed to continued air attack. A third wave struck, then a fourth. Allied controllers maintained constant pressure, preventing German forces from organizing effective recovery operations. Fuel trucks exploded, creating massive fireballs that spread fires to adjacent vehicles. Ammunition trucks detonated with such force that debris rained down hundreds of meters away. The smoke from burning vehicles rose thousands of feet, visible from Allied positions miles distant. Some German crews fought back with desperate courage. Anti-aircraft gunners remained at their posts despite repeated strafing runs. A few Allied aircraft were hit, trailing smoke as they withdrew toward friendly territory. But the imbalance was overwhelming. For every aircraft damaged, dozens of German vehicles were destroyed or disabled. The attack continued for over an hour, though it felt like an eternity to those on the ground. By the time the last Allied aircraft departed, the 20-kilometer column had been transformed into a 20-kilometer graveyard. Burnout hulks littered the roads. Bodies lay in ditches and fields. Survivors gathered in small groups, stunned by the speed and violence of the destruction. The decisive moment came approximately 30 minutes into the attack, when the final reserves of coordinated resistance collapsed. Until that point, despite horrific losses, some elements of the Panzer unit had maintained tactical cohesion. Battalion commanders still communicated with subordinate units. Anti-aircraft crews still engaged attacking aircraft with disciplined fire. Tank crews still attempted to maneuver their vehicles to defensive positions. But the relentless waves of attacking aircraft overwhelmed these efforts. A critical turning point occurred when a series of strikes destroyed the column's command vehicles. German armor doctrine relied heavily on radio communication for coordination. Command half-tracks, equipped with powerful radios and staffed by battalion and regimental commanders, were essential nodes in the command structure. When these vehicles were destroyed, the entire organizational framework collapsed. The loss of command and control was immediately apparent. Units stopped receiving orders. Company and platoon commanders, cut off from higher headquarters, made independent decisions based on incomplete information. Some ordered withdrawal. Others continued attempting to advance. Still others simply abandoned their vehicles and sought survival in the countryside. The Panzer unit, which had moved with mechanical precision that morning, disintegrated into isolated groups acting without coordination or unified purpose. A flight of Typhoons identified a Tiger tank attempting to reverse away from burning vehicles ahead of it. The Tiger was one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, a 56-ton fortress mounting an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable to conventional anti-tank weapons. Crews felt relatively safe inside Tigers, confident in their vehicle's protection. But that protection was designed for ground combat, not aerial attack. The Tiger's roof armor was only 40mm thick, adequate against artillery fragments but vulnerable to rockets and bombs striking from above. The Typhoon pilot fired his rockets in a tight salvo. 3 rockets struck within meters of the Tiger. 1 penetrated the engine deck. The Tiger's Maybach engine, a marvel of German engineering but notoriously prone to fire, erupted in flames. Fuel lines ruptured. Within seconds, the entire rear of the tank was engulfed. The crew attempted to evacuate, but the turret hatch was jammed by the blast. Only the driver and radio operator escaped through the forward hull hatches. The commander, gunner, and loader perished in the inferno. This scene repeated itself across the column. Tanks that had survived frontal engagements with Allied armor on a dozen battlefields were reduced to burning scrap by weapons they had never been designed to counter. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. German panzer crews had developed a sense of superiority based on their tanks' technical advantages. They knew that in direct combat, their Tigers and Panthers could destroy Shermans and Cromwells at ranges where the Allied tanks could not effectively return fire. This superiority bred confidence, even arrogance. The armor was their castle, their protection, their weapon. Air attack shattered that confidence. Inside a tank under aerial bombardment, crews were helpless. They could not effectively return fire. They could not maneuver to improve their defensive position. They could only wait, praying that the next rocket or bomb would miss. Many experienced veterans, men who had faced Soviet armor at Kursk or fought across North Africa, broke psychologically under sustained air attack. They abandoned operational vehicles, no longer trusting the steel that had previously protected them. The breaking point came when a Panther battalion, still relatively intact, received orders to continue advancing toward their objective. The battalion commander, surveying the destruction around him and recognizing that more Allied aircraft would inevitably arrive, refused the order. It was an extraordinary act of insubordination in an army where disobedience could result in summary execution. But the commander concluded that advancing would simply deliver his remaining tanks to further slaughter. He ordered dispersal and concealment instead. This decision, repeated by multiple unit commanders along the column, marked the effective end of the Panzer unit as a fighting force. Units that dispersed into hedgerows and farmsteads for concealment could not be quickly reassembled. Tanks hidden in barns or camouflaged in tree lines were temporarily safe from air attack but were tactically useless. The unit had been transformed from an offensive weapon into scattered survivors focused solely on self-preservation. The final Allied strikes targeted the logistics tail of the column. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and supply vehicles lacked the armor protection of combat vehicles. They were devastatingly vulnerable to machine gun fire and fragmentation bombs. When the logistics tail was destroyed, even undamaged tanks became immobilized. Without fuel, they were pillboxes. Without ammunition, they were shelters. Without spare parts, mechanical failures could not be repaired. As the sun began to set on that summer evening, the 20-kilometer column no longer existed as a military formation. Approximately 60% of its vehicles had been destroyed or severely damaged. Another 20% had been abandoned by crews who believed them doomed. The remaining vehicles were scattered across the countryside, hidden, out of fuel, or mechanically broken down. The elite Panzer unit that had departed that morning with orders to reinforce the Normandy front would never arrive at its destination. In the immediate aftermath, German forces attempted salvage operations under cover of darkness. Recovery teams moved along the devastated column, identifying vehicles that might be repaired or cannibalized for parts. The results were discouraging. Most tanks had suffered catastrophic damage. Tigers with turrets blown off could not be restored. Panthers with cracked engine blocks were worthless. Half-tracks riddled with fragmentation holes were beyond field repair. The human cost was equally severe. Casualty reports were incomplete due to the destruction of unit records, but estimates suggested between 200 and 400 personnel killed or severely wounded. Many bodies could not be recovered from burning vehicles. Others lay scattered across fields where they had sought cover. Medical services, overwhelmed by casualties across the entire front, could provide only basic treatment. The survivors were interviewed by German intelligence officers attempting to understand what had occurred. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The attack had been devastating in speed and violence. The volume of ordnance delivered was overwhelming. Attempts at organized defense had been futile. Multiple officers recommended that future movements of armored formations during daylight hours should be avoided entirely, regardless of tactical urgency. These recommendations reached higher headquarters, but they arrived too late to influence operations. The pattern established that day would repeat itself across Normandy in the weeks that followed. German armor attempting to move during daylight was systematically destroyed from the air. Units that should have reached the front in hours instead took days, arriving piecemeal and exhausted. The Wehrmacht's ability to conduct mobile operations, the foundation of blitzkrieg doctrine, had been effectively neutralized. Allied intelligence assessed the strike as extraordinarily successful. Reconnaissance flights over the area confirmed the extent of destruction. Interpreters counting destroyed vehicles and aerial photographs tallied dozens of heavy tanks, vehicles Germany could not afford to lose. The psychological impact on surviving German forces was noted with satisfaction. Prisoners captured in subsequent days spoke of demoralization, of feeling helpless against air attack, of losing confidence in their officers' ability to protect them. The tactical lessons were immediately incorporated into Allied doctrine. Air-ground coordination was proven effective. The concentration of air power against mobile targets delivered decisive results. The techniques developed over years of experimentation had been validated in combat. Commands were issued to increase the priority of interdiction strikes against German armor movements. Additional fighter-bomber squadrons were allocated to ground support roles. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate battle. Germany's entire defensive strategy in the West relied on mobile reserves, armored formations held back from the front line that could be rushed forward to contain Allied breakthroughs. If these reserves could be destroyed during their movement to the front, German defensive depth would collapse. The static defense would have to hold without expectation of reinforcement, a mathematically impossible task against Allied material superiority. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, had warned repeatedly about the danger of Allied air superiority. His experience in North Africa had taught him that mobile operations under enemy air dominance were suicidal. He had advocated for positioning armored reserves close to the beaches, accepting the risk of naval gunfire to avoid the certainty of aerial interdiction. Hitler had overruled him, insisting on maintaining central reserves. The destruction of this Panzer unit vindicated Rommel's concerns, but too late to change German strategy. The engagement entered military history as a case study in air power application. War colleges and staff schools analyzed the strike for decades. It demonstrated that air superiority could decisively influence ground operations, that technological advantage could offset numerical disadvantage, that innovation in tactics and technology could revolutionize warfare. The lessons informed Cold War military doctrine, influencing everything from tank design to air defense systems to tactical movement procedures. For the individuals involved, the impact was intensely personal. Allied pilots celebrated the successful mission, adding to kill tallies that would be counted at war's end. Some struggled with the violence they had inflicted, the knowledge that each burning tank had contained human beings. German survivors carried memories of helplessness and terror, experiences that would shape their attitudes toward military service and warfare for the rest of their lives. The broader narrative of the war shifted incrementally. The destruction of this single unit contributed to the eventual collapse of German defenses in Normandy. The breakout, when it came, encountered weakened resistance partially because reinforcements had been destroyed before reaching the front. The liberation of France proceeded faster than planners had anticipated. The war in Europe ended months earlier than some pessimistic projections had suggested. Each of these outcomes traced back, in part, to the techniques and technologies demonstrated in that single strike. In the final analysis, the destruction of an elite Panzer unit across 20 kilometers of French countryside represented more than tactical success. It marked the maturation of air power as a decisive element in combined arms warfare. It validated years of technological development and tactical innovation. It demonstrated that traditional advantages in ground combat could be negated by superiority in another dimension. The age of the tank as the supreme arbiter of ground warfare had not ended, but it had been fundamentally complicated by a new reality where movement itself invited destruction from above. The legacy endures in modern military thinking. Contemporary armed forces invest heavily in air defense systems because they understand the lesson of that summer day in 1944. Commanders plan movements with constant awareness of aerial threat. Tanks are designed with protection against top attack weapons. The single strike that crippled an elite Panzer unit across 20 kilometers continues to echo through military doctrine, a reminder that dominance in one domain can be decisive, that technology can shift the balance of warfare, and that adaptation to new realities separates victory from catastrophic defeat.